On July 6th, 2026, Andrea Shaw, who is a 23-year-old mother from Idaho, was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder connected to the deaths of her infant twins 14 months prior. Police and the medical examiners contend that the 18-month-old twins were smothered to death by their mother in their shared crib. If true, this act is truly a heinous example of infanticide. But what makes this killing even more notable is that since May 2025, Shaw, their mother, has publicly blamed the death of the twins on vaccines. She appeared last year on a video for an anti-vaccination organization founded by RFK Jr. Further, in January of 2026, Shaw joined as a plaintiff for the suit against the American Academy of Pediatrics. The suit is meant to silence the AAP as it refused to acquiesce to RFK Jr.'s unscientific changes to the childhood vaccine schedule. You may be forgiven if you think that Andrea Shaw's case would constitute some sort of fluke within the anti-vaccination movement, an extreme outlier disconnected with their core philosophy or strategies. But you'd be wrong. For some context, my name is Brad, I'm a bioethicist, I'm a medical school professor, and I've studied online disinformation for the past 15 years. I even wrote my dissertation on anti-vaccination parents of children with autism. During this time, I've come to more deeply understand the dynamics that fuel science denialism. What I've found is that while using anti-vaccination rhetoric to obscure infanticide would be something incredibly rare, the Shaw case underscores a tactic that is far too common within the anti-vaccination movement: fleeing from freedom. I'm sure that last sentence does not make a lot of sense right now, but stick with me and I promise you it will. For many years, vaccine skeptics targeted parents of children with autism, promising answers and cures as a guise to funnel them deeper and deeper into online anti-vaccination communities. But around 2018, online anti-vaccination activists like Larry Cook started a new tack, targeting parents of children who had died suddenly. This operation was far from surgical, such as the time it attributed a vaccine death to a child who had died in a car crash, or claimed that a teenager died of the COVID vaccine months before he could have even received the jab. Even some supposed victims of fatal vaccine injuries were actually still alive. But overall, these emotionally wrenching stories stick in the minds of those flirting with vaccine hesitancy, often pushing them over the edge. One such story is the 2019 case of Eevee, a healthy 6-month-old baby who, according to her mother, Caitlin, died within 36 hours of receiving multiple vaccines. Eevee became a literal poster child for the anti-vaccination movement, with her images adorning websites, protest signs, even billboards. It became a national campaign, both online, with Facebook posts boasting hundreds of thousands of views, and in the real world, as Caitlin, her mother, read the story out loud in the State House chambers. Fundraisers for Eevee raised tens of thousands of dollars. Eevee's story seems to confirm all the fears and rhetoric of the anti-vaccination movement. The only problem? It's not true.
It's fiction.
Now, Eevee had tragically died. However, just like in the Shaw case, the medical examiners ruled that Eevee had died from suffocation, and this was no idle ruling. All of the evidence from both the autopsy and the reports from the first responders to the scene all point to accidental suffocation for Eevee. Caitlin herself admitted it. During her 911 call, she told the operator that Eevee had died, quote, because she was sleeping with me, end quote. Caitlin had a habit of co-sleeping with Eevee. That night, Caitlin laid Eevee down for the night in her own queen bed, drank a whiskey cocktail, turned on the basketball game, and later got into bed with Eevee. The next morning, Caitlin woke up to Eevee cold and not moving. The later examination of Eevee's body found creases on her face consistent with the blankets on the bed, and Eevee's nose, chest, arms, and legs were discolored, where blood had pooled in her body. Eevee had died face down and was in that position for a long time before her death. Caitlin seems to have unknowingly rolled over onto Eevee in the middle of the night, and as a result, the baby had died. There's no evidence that vaccines had anything to do with it. Eevee's death was certainly accidental. What happened next was not. The day after Eevee's death, her mother went onto social media to vent her grief and anger. Before there was even an autopsy or any sort of medical evaluation, Caitlin complained how the, quote, unanswered questions of how Eevee died or why makes it worse, end quote. This post went viral, garnering 500,000 views and thousands of comments. Within hours, the comments to these posts went from providing condolences to blaming vaccines. Anti-vaccination activists flooded the post, convinced that Eevee's vaccinations must have killed her, inviting Caitlin to join their community. Caitlin abruptly changed her initial assessment of Eevee's death, declaring that, quote, "I have safely co-slept with my daughter. That has nothing to do with her death," end quote. Caitlin deeply delved into vaccine skepticism and became an ardent anti-vaccination advocate. The facts surrounding the accidental suffocation of Eevee had not changed, but her mother's interpretation certainly had. But why at the beginning of all this would I say that Caitlin and other members of the anti-vaccination movement are fleeing from freedom? If anything, isn't Caitlin gaining more freedom to be able to interpret the facts that pleases her more? Isn't Caitlin unshackling herself from the verdicts of official sounding organizations? Well, according to the French existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, Caitlin is abandoning what he would call the anguish of freedom for what I will call the comforts of confinement. In 1945, Sartre famously stated that, quote, "Our existence precedes our essence," end quote. Now, this probably sounds like a whole bunch of French gobbledygook. However, what Sartre is saying here is not only thought-provoking, but also empowering. In philosophy, a person's essence is a collection of attributes and properties that make you, well, you. For thousands of years, the prevailing philosophy around your essence is that it was fundamentally predetermined by providence or society before you were even born. That the essence of who you are going to be and what you are going to be able to do preceded your actual existence. Sartre flipped this notion on its head. Sartre argued that you first exist and experience the world with all of its machinations. Through these experiences, you encounter a growing sense of who you are. You then push into the world your essence. This is an ongoing project. Your experiences are on a feedback loop with your essence, perpetually defining and redefining it throughout your lifetime. Importantly, you're not some passive agent in the development of your own essence, at least not according to Sartre. Instead, the engine of our essence are the choices that we make. Because you are free from a predetermined meaning, you are a free agent, able to freely choose and experience the consequences of the choices you made. Your choices reverberate throughout the world and into the very essence of who you are. It is because you are free from a predetermined meaning that you're able to create a meaning in your own life. While Sartre came to such conclusions through his own atheistic viewpoint, he argued that his own existential philosophy is not exclusive to atheism. Sartre asserted that agnostics or even theists would agree that the meaning for humans is not, or at least should not, be forced upon them, that humans have free choice, and therefore have a free meaning for their life. Because we have free choice, we are ultimately responsible for what we become. We are responsible for our own essence. That responsibility is truly grand and truly terrible. For Sartre, we have no excuse to avoid the consequences of our choices. We cannot avoid responsibility by blaming God or nature or institutions or even the universe. We are completely responsible for our choices and our own essence. Hold on. Some of you might be thinking or even yelling at the screen right now. There are so many circumstances that are outside of our own control. We're born into neighborhoods, families, nations, economic circumstances, biologies in which we had no choice, but that still profoundly affect our ability to choose. This is unequivocally true. And Sartre was not so naive as to ignore this fact. When Sartre is discussing freedom, he is not conceiving it as being limitless. No one has unlimited choices, and no one's choices take place in vacuums divorced from the trials and temptations of the world. But just because our choices are limited and bound within certain constraints does not mean that we have no choices. Whether you're the prisoner, the guard, or the warden, you still have to make free choices every day that mold your essence and the meaning you derive from it. As such, you are still wholly responsible for the consequences of those freely made choices. Even choosing not to choose is still a free choice. This is what Sartre called the anguish of freedom. Now, some may try and avoid this anguish by refusing to acknowledge that they are in fact free, or they may claim that they must act or live a certain way, that they have no other options but this one path. Sartre would say that such people are living in bad faith, that we cannot in good faith say that we are not free agents with the ability to choose a different path, even if that path is dire or has painful consequences. We are still free to make that choice. In other words, people may deny or dodge the consequences of their choices, but such maneuvers only do violence to their own essence. They do not nullify their naked responsibility for their free choices. All of this brings us back to our anti-vaccination moms. And now, hopefully it's more clear how, if guilty of infanticide, Andrea Shaw blaming vaccines for the death of her twins is a means of escaping Sartre's vision of freedom. If Shaw did murder her children, her grotesque unwillingness to accept the consequences of her choice simultaneously denies both the responsibility for that choice and the freedom she exercised when making it. The same is also true for Caitlin, even though it is not alleged that Eevee's death was intentional. From the moment she found the baby dead, Caitlin had, admittedly, a horrendous choice. Accept the consequences of freely choosing to engage in the dangerous habit of co-sleeping with an infant, or grasp for unlikely scenarios that nullify those consequences and thus the responsibility and freedom of her choice. Caitlin chose the latter. In either case, by scapegoating vaccines, these women back themselves into saying that their choices were not free, but compelled by forces beyond their control. It was big pharma, or chemicals, or state school boards, or public health officials. While the criminal culpability varies, their joint insistence against all evidence that the deaths of these children were related to vaccines confines their freedom into a cage of easy comforts. They no longer have to face the raw anguish of their free choices. So these mothers, and thousands of people like them, are not running to anti-vaccination groups to gain their freedom, but to flee from it. It would be easy to dismiss these as fringe cases, not representative of the anti-vaccination movement as a whole, nor of its core philosophies. Of course, not every person who joins the anti-vaccination movement has lost a child, and very few would be so involved in that death. However, the entire anti-vaccination enterprise could be viewed as a means of avoiding freedom. If you want to read that complete argument, head over to my new Substack page. I have the link pinned below. My Substack page is also where I'll be responding to comments on this video, as well as some other videos, so follow me there if you want to read those.